scare people away by telling them we're going to discuss the reading. To see if I had a bunch of I can't either emails, but looks like no. Alrighty, well, we will go ahead and get started. Good morning, good to see everybody. Looks like a few more people have popped in online. So Jaden and Emily, today's going to be mostly discussion based, so please feel free to use the comments or unmute yourselves and participate as well. Thank you, few but mighty, who showed up today. I appreciate it very much. Alrighty, so as I was mentioning on Wednesday, I went ahead and made a PowerPoint sort of, that's basically like a list of discussion questions for us about the reading. And figured we could talk about it. Since so few of you came today, maybe more people will show up, we'll see. But you know, I'm not gonna drag this out. So like if we get to the end of a discussion question, we get through sort of all the questions, and we're good and we end early, that's okay. I'm not gonna punish you all for actually showing up. So thank you again for being here. And we will dive on into talking about bias in science. Alrighty, so these are the various readings that you did for today. These were all perusal readings, they were articles, and I believe this first one I may have like assigned you twice, so this one may have felt familiar, so apologies, but also I'm sure it wasn't super sad to find something familiar. So just to sort of summarize, this research looked at what gets published essentially, and who are the people who are publishing it, and how does that determine things. So in general, this one's more of a like, you know, general, we can think about things in a more abstract way question. You know, how does race play a role in people's psychology? Like, why should we care about studying race in psychology? Yeah, Devin. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's such a good point, right? That our race is really linked to our culture, right? It's really linked to our history. You know, as you saw in the documents you read for today, our race is linked to the history of psychology and how sometimes we have not been good people within this field. So yeah, I think that that is an important point as well. So yeah, perfect, go ahead. Exactly. Yeah. So it can come from your family, right? And your race and your identity, and that can really influence how you see the world, how you're affected by things in the world, right? It also can really affect what you experience, right? So unfortunately, still in America, if you are a person of color, right, you're going to experience discrimination, and it might be subtle, right? Or it might be jokes, right? Such good jokes, right? Or it might be obvious still. I think about, not only the police brutality against largely African Americans, but worldwide also Indigenous people. So for example, in Australia, they have the same problem we do with police brutality, but for the Aboriginal people. Sounds like a tornado. I think it's just a plane going over. So it certainly is an issue worldwide, right? And I think about, the attacks on Asian American people in the past year, people blaming them for the coronavirus, right? And some of those were pretty brutal. So yeah, I think that that's really important. So how often is research highlighting risk? Griffin, it sounds like you're finding a lot that do. That's awesome. But in general, when you run into stuff, what are you all finding? And I'm actually going to pull up the reading just so that we can look at their stats. So what do you all think? How often is research actually looking at race as an issue? What's that?
I assume it can't be a focus of anything.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So the reason I want to pull this up is because they do have some really interesting stats here. But yeah, it's unusual in some ways, unfortunately, to address race, basically. Mine here. There we go. Okay. So they looked at 26,000 articles for this. And they found that it was usually less than 10% of articles that highlighted race. And they found that like a lot of those were written by white scholars, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but does mean we might be missing the perspectives of people who have these lived experiences, right? I'll give you an example. So I just saw something on Twitter about an Indigenous woman whose work was plagiarized by a group of white scholars. And she tried to be very gracious about it and just be like, please cite me, right? And so there were like 3 places in the paper they had plagiarized from her, and they'd done it to other people too. And so the first draft they sent back, they had done 1. And the second draft they had done 2. And the third draft, they're like, we don't know where to put the citation for the other one. And like, she was like, really? And so that is not typical, I would say, but unfortunately, sometimes we do have instances where that is happening. So in terms of, just looking at even fairly recent history, right? The 2010s is really not that far. I don't want to make a comment. I know you think I did because I highlighted something. But the 2010s is not that long ago, right? I started here. Then only 5% of publications highlighted race. So 1,500 out of this 26,000 that they looked at, right? So again, sometimes people are like, well, my article is not about race, right? And then some people try to argue for like color blindness and like race shouldn't matter. But we know a lot of the stuff we've talked about in this class, and I'm sure you've learned about in other classes, that race is linked to a whole host of socioeconomic factors. that mean access to not as good education, for example, and experiences of discrimination that might create more psychological symptoms. Yeah, definitely not great. I already kind of answered the next one. It tends to be more of white scholars. And in terms of who is publishing it, who are the editors of this? So what they found is that among the 60 editors-in-chief of journals, this is the person who makes the final decisions on what actually gets published. 5% were people of color, and then 12% they were not sure, but 83% were white. So maybe a max of 17%, probably more something in between those two numbers. For when these things happened, 93% of the population publications were edited by white editors-in-chief. So again, it doesn't mean people who are white can't do this. Part of what's happening here is that people of color just haven't been afforded the same opportunities, right? So to be an editor-in-chief at a journal, you have to sort of be recognized as a leader in your field. You know, when you're denied access to quality education, when you are denied access to, you know, equal resources, you are treated like you don't belong, like we talked about on Wednesday, how people will be like, are you part of the maintenance staff? Things along those lines, right? It's really difficult to get these things done. And what they also found is that the people who are writing these do tend to be more authors of color as the years go on. And I think part of that is just largely like related to what I just said, right? Like we have more scholars of color in the field now, which is great. So thinking about this and thinking about sort of all these perceptions and proportions that they talk about in this article, I'm just going to scooch forward to the next article. What are the implications for how we should think about race, how we should talk about race, how we should be researching race? What do y'all think? I think one of the big things that stands out for me, and again, people online, feel free to unmute or put something in the comments as well. But what stands out for me is that we're not prioritizing looking at these differences. We're not prioritizing. Again, some people will see it as a good thing, where they're like, oh, it's excellent that, you know, we're not looking at race because we're colorblind. But by doing that, we essentially erase the existence and maybe the unique experiences of people of color. And that can obviously be problematic. Alrighty, so the next article is a pretty short one by one of my favorite authors, Cordelia Fine. So her large book that she has written about the same topic is called Delusions of Gender. So she talks about how people make these generalizations about gender differences in the brain that actually, if you really look at the research, don't exist, essentially. So what are the arguments? And again, just thinking about what you've heard maybe on the news or in other ways, what arguments are made about how male and female brains are different? Yeah.
So I also heard that males are more able to.
Yeah. Well, we definitely hear that. And in fact, I think we've talked about in here, right? Like it might just be we're missing the women because they tend to have more of the inattentive features, which are most disruptive. Yeah. Other things you've heard. Yeah, over. Yeah, exactly. So if you look at just initial research looking at spatial ability, so things like there are tests called mental rotation, where they give you like a picture of a 3D object, and then you have to like mentally rotate it to match it with another picture of the same object, basically. And when you look at that, just like give it to men and women do actually tend to do worse. But one of the things Fine picks apart about that particular research in her book is that there are some priming effects. So if you say this is a measure of spatial rotation or spatial ability, women know exactly what Oliver just said. Women know I'm supposed to be bad at this. If you say this is a task, do it, women do better if they don't like have that prime. Another article, another piece of research she cites shows that if you just ask people to identify their gender before they do this task, women do worse than if you ask them to identify their gender afterwards. Like just priming them of like, oh, I'm female, can do that. The other, like one of my favorite studies that has looked at this, sort of tried to look at like why might these differences exist if they're not innate. And one of the things in the modern world is that, you know, even though I think about half of gamers are now female, in general, we tend to think of males as being more into successful at video gaming. And so they had women and men both play a video game for 15 minutes before they did it, and all the differences disappeared. So there are a lot of, you know, other things that go into that. What other things have you heard? Looks like we got something in the chat, so I'll pop that open. Hardware differences, yeah, that these are things we can't change, right? But these are just things that exist, and there's nothing we can do about it. Yeah, Griffin. Oh, interesting.
Maybe just kind of like that high intensity, like, you know, aspect of it.
Sure. Do you remember, were they like open world games or were they just like contained?
I don't exactly remember.
Okay.
It was like, you know,
Probably something they did before. Yeah. And it could be, again, that men are more socialized to that type of stuff and women are not. The reason I asked about open world games is that we know that women get a lot more harassment when they're playing online with other people. So obviously that expressed it out. But yeah, there could be some differences that exist for those as well, right? And again, I think a lot of this might exist, but might be learned, socialized, right? Rather than being innately born. I mean, one of my favorite professors at grad school had this way of talking about it where he was like, look, we don't, like, the human brain is just not hardwired to drive a car, right? And yet we can all do it, right? We learn to do a lot of stuff, and a lot of stuff that is adaptive, we don't necessarily have this sort of hardwiring for. So what do you all think of it? I'm just realizing that like all of these questions are kind of asking you all the same thing. So apologies for that. But, you know, what evidence have you all seen, either again on the news or sort of anecdotally, that some of these ideas we have about like what men and women can do or what people of certain genders can do are not quite as hardwired as we think? Even just think about, yeah, Oliver, go ahead. That's interesting. Right, but yeah, that there might be differences, and that makes sense because, you know, we haven't quite sorted it, but we do know that autism has probably got a genetic component, and it probably is in the brain, right? So that would make sense that there actually would be perhaps those differences. Yeah. I mean, I think about, we have examples of, you know, people who are really great in opposite fields to what we assume their gender would be good at, right? If we think of like, no one brought this up, but of like women as being innately hardwired to care, right? We have excellent male doctors and nurses, right? I just think about people like Gandhi or the Dalai Lama as well, right? Who clearly have that ethic of care. And the same thing if we think about, men as being better at sort of engineering technical stuff. We know there are women who have risen through those different ranks and, again, excel at these things. Emily says in her comment, society continually influences those ideas that we have that this way because we're a girl or a guy. Yeah, exactly. And I mean, one of the big problems with all of these assumptions, right, is just the assumption that like gender is totally binary, right? And all women are the same and all men are the same. A, it ignores people who are non-binary, trans, identify in different ways, but B, it ignores the fact that within genders, people really differ on how masculine or feminine they are, right? Alrighty, let's keep trucking along here. So the next article was about intersectionality and research in psychology. So what is intersectionality? Again, anyone can answer either based on the reading or based on knowledge you've learned in other classes, for example. Exactly. Yeah, sorry, I didn't figure it over. I apologize. Yeah, so it is essentially, we tend to do things, and the first two articles we read even did this, right? Where we look at just race or just gender. But intersectionality says, oh, again, we need to consider within those if people experience things in different ways, right? So for example, men of color are going to experience things in different ways than white men, right? You know, women who are not straight, right, will experience more discrimination than women who are straight. Just again, because of our contemporary society's morals and values, again, that wouldn't necessarily be true in cultures where non-binariness or more fluid sexuality or homosexuality are more common and accepted, for example. So in my WGS class this semester, we did a great reading about the indigenous concept of two-spirit. So a lot of Native American tribes, nations had like a third gender or like ideas about gender fluidity that when the colonists came in, they tried to essentially erase. And so like these are not new concepts, right? These have existed before. And all of these things can come together. And so one of the positive things Cole said is that there are more psychological articles actually looking at intersectionality. So why do you think more people are looking at this when they do research? Yeah, over. No, it's fine. Please do. Oh, this might be a little different. Yeah, exactly. So, especially within psychology, getting to know the specific needs, issues of people of different races, genders, intersectional identities. And then part of it is just also just awareness of the idea, right? So Kimberly Crenshaw was a Black female scholar who wrote about intersectionality in the late 80s, and that was the first time that this had a word, right? So it kind of makes more sense that, like, of course, there's been more publications that looked at it since then because it didn't kind of exist, even though conceptually it did. So I wanted to take a minute to look at this great chart that Cole had in this article, where she kind of looks at, she came up with 3 questions that we should be asking about any piece of research we do or any piece of research we read, essentially. So who is included within the category of people we're looking at? What role does inequality play, right? Because sometimes we're making generalizations about, oh, well, people of this gender, this race, this nationality, this age, are just different, when in fact it could be what's happening in society. And then this last one is a huge one that especially people who study the psychology of gender have been talking about for years. So people ask, what are the differences? But an important question that gets left out are what are the similarities? How are people of different genders, different races, different ages similar? And the thing that sucks is that we have what's called a publication bias in psychology, which is essentially it's more easy to get stuff published if you find significant results. Even though sometimes finding non-significant results can be the most important thing, right? The most interesting thing, something that really adds to our knowledge. This is sometimes called the file drawer problem because people literally used to have just like drawers in their filing cabinet where they'd like throw these papers when they got rejected because they just, journals again would be looking for this. Journals are trying to combat this. So for example, I'm on the editorial board of 3 different journals, and one of them is specifically carving out a type of submission for non-significant results, which I think is really cool. So, but again, this has been the sort of status quo in psychology till now. So for example, just thinking at the very beginning of doing a research study, how do you generate hypotheses, right? Well, we need to think about who's included within this category. So we need to think about diversity within categories of what we're thinking about. What role does inequality play? We need to not just have a very general literature review, right? We need to think about social and historical context that may apply here, right? Maybe we have exploratory analyses to look at similarities rather than assuming we're going to find differences. Sampling, if we're truly doing what Cole is suggesting, we should be looking at those neglected groups. So for example, a couple of years ago, I got a development grant from the school to collect data to look at body image in lesbian, gay, and bisexual individuals. Most of the time, people are not looking at these folks. And if they are, they're like a very small part of their sample, right? So finding the time, finding the money to focus on these groups that haven't been studied, because it might be we find similarities, or it might be there are things we've been missing that are distinct that could inform, say, future therapy for folks with these issues. Thinking about groups with unequal access to power and resources rather than just this group is superior because, right? I mean, for years, this was the research. Well, whites do better than blacks because they're just smarter. No, it's because of their access to education, right? So, thinking about those implications. And then viewing social categories in terms of individual and institutional, including diverse groups. I was on the wrong line. So I'm not going to go through this line by line, but I think one important one that we should talk about briefly is analysis. So a lot of people tend to think statistics are numbers, right? Statistics are just going to give you an unbiased answer. As we just talked about before the second exam, right? That's not necessarily true. You can interpret statistics in lots of ways that can skew things. You can run things in skewed ways. You can make your charts in ways that misrepresent, right? So attending to diversity within a group, and you might need to conduct analyses separately for each group study because you might find different patterns, or again, we might go back and find similarities or expected differences. So we should be testing for both similarities and differences and not just focusing on differences. And then when we interpret those, I really like this of like sensitivity to very nuanced variations, right? I think a lot of times when we write discussion sections, we tend to write in broad strokes. And I mean, this is like, we've talked about this in the past, like this is just a problem of generalization, right? Where people will have this small sample and be like, clearly this applies to all people ever. Probably not, right? Okay. So back in 1988, Denmark et al., Florence Denmark, a very famous social psychologist, came up with guidelines for avoiding sexism in psychological research. And so very similar to what we just looked at, sexism, as all other isms, can come up at every step of the way. And again, I'm just going to buff over to perusal to show you some examples here. Gotta scroll through. There we go. So I'll just give you some of the examples they give, right? So, gender stereotypes being included even unintentionally in hypotheses that are made, right? Again, something like, well, the women will just be more caring. Not necessarily, right? So examples of like studies that define leadership in terms of things that are very male typical, and this is something we're still guilty of today, where we tend to feel like you need to be aggressive to be a good leader, right? And things along those lines, where in fact we do know that there are a range of leadership styles, and industrial organizational psychology has really informed us on this, and that there are a range of styles that can be effective and different versions you can bring. And of course, if our research is being posited that way and then we're presenting our results that way, that can influence how people think about things, right? Especially if it gets into the popular press. And popular press loves a good like race or sex difference finding, right? Studies are showing that men and women are different in how much they like Pokemon. That must be part of the brain, right? I mean, that's a silly answer, a silly example, but things along those lines. So again, these came out in 1988. And just to answer for you, a lot of these changes haven't been made. This is the continual frustration of people who advocate for change, really not just within psychology, within any subfield, is that people tend to be pretty entrenched in their own ways. And it makes it really difficult, essentially, to get changes done. Even here at Wesleyan, when we advocate for diversity, equity, and inclusion, a lot of times we're told things like, oh, well, it'll just be fine, right? Or, oh, that's not how we do things, right? The Wesleyan way is something the faculty members sort of joke about. Very good question. Yeah, so Dr. Bartol asked that at a meeting of the president, and no, they have done zero green initiatives. I think I watched them putting in some of the landscaping yesterday. I think some of those might be native plants. But yeah, no, Dr. Bartol was pretty upset, as are all of us, if we're making all these assumptions and saying, well, we're a green campus, like, touting Greer as being, certified, LEED certified, right? And then we just like, oh, we're building a mansion and we don't care. And we're gonna have a swimming pool, which obviously is not necessarily the most environmentally friendly thing. Nor student friendly. Although I have to admit, I'm glad that the fence is giant, because I was just imagining some poor, under the influence of various substances, perhaps student like stumbling into the pool and stuff. Or climbing the fence, that looks like might be difficult. Yeah. I hadn't even thought about that, but you're right. They're going to. Yeah, the geese are like ever present, right? Yeah, I remember when Good opened, they hired border collies for the week beforehand to scare off all the geese. They even put out like cutouts that looked like border collies. And it worked for like their fancy openings, but then of course they came right back once they stopped it. Yeah, I mean, it's part of habitat destruction, it's part of climate change, right? Which is why, as David is pointing out, that we should have some green initiatives for every new building built on this campus. But yeah, like Canada geese just kind of stay here year round now because like they're very comfortable in the weather we have year round, right? And that may not have been the case 5-10 years ago. I would guess because it's new construction, it has to be. Yeah, I think part of the problem on campus is that a lot of the buildings were built in the 60s and 70s before ADA came out. And ADA, we sort of, they call it grandfather clause, where you don't have to adjust things, which is why we don't have an elevator over in like, what are those buildings over there? You know, over in Village One, right? So that kind of buildings over there. So yeah, I think that it will have to be. But yeah, I mean, here's another thing, another example, right? Of like making things accessible. Giving you another example in academia, for years and years, people with disabilities have said, it's difficult for us to travel, but we still want to contribute to our field and gain new knowledge. Can we attend conference virtually? And people have, and this is not just psychology, this is literally like every field. They've been like, no, it's not possible, it's too expensive. Well, guess what? I've attended like 6 conferences virtually in the past year and a half, right? So it is possible. And, you know, now they want to like back off of it. And then obviously since the pandemic's still going on, they're not. But it's like immediately it's going to be again like, nope, can't do it. And it's really frustrating, right? And that limits your ability as a person with a disability to network with other people, to again learn about the new science before it's published, because oftentimes people present it at conferences before they publish it. So yeah, that's something that's really problematic. It's really like we have on our radar as feminist psychologists for sure.
Last year, I could get up to 100, and I did it because of funding reasons, but I could do that.
Which is frustrating, for sure. And I have been, and as you all have seen, I just do it, an advocate for continuing that remote option because of access issues and because, like, let's say y'all just get strep throat, but you want to still attend class. Now you don't have to infect us, right? Like, rock on. And thank God I had it in place when I had to go remote, right? Like, thank God I thought through, like, this is going to happen. I have a 3-year-old, right? But yeah, I think that we want to pretend everything is fine and ignore it, right? And instead, I feel like we should be learning from that. I think there's a fear that people will start to see those as like online classes and want to pay different rates, and we'll lose our liberal arts community. And I personally just feel like I've built a community virtually, right? Like, I had great conversations last year, and even in the months that we had to be remote, right? So yeah, I think that that's a big thing that going forward, we need to be thinking about is how do we improve access for everyone? All right, and then the last 2 things you read were related. It was the draft APA resolution, which is an apology for psychology's role in preventing racism, discrimination, and human hierarchy. And then the second thing with that was the timeline of all of the things that psychology have done that isn't quite right in terms of race. So what's your first reaction to this resolution existing? It's basically a resolution to say, we're sorry. What are your thoughts on that? Yeah, why? Right, right? Yeah, I think that's a big thing. And that's when I was on the perusal, someone had kind of talked about that. It's my daughter loves Daniel Tiger, and so I thought if there's a little song that says saying I'm sorry is the first step, then you need to say, how can I help? Right? And there's a little bit of that in there, like, therefore be it resolved. But yeah, kind of what Devin said, just do it. Just actually go and make these changes, not just say you're going to make them, right? And that's a big piece of this. What do you think would show true change within psychology as a field or within, anywhere in academia? Would show true change in terms of, let's just focus on race right now, because that's what this resolution is about. Like, how could we actually make a difference for people of color and people from indigenous backgrounds. Yeah, that's really important, right? Make sure their voices are heard on the committees that are actually really organizing and designing everything. Let's be honest, right? Think about these types of issues. I think another big thing we can do is to think about equity in terms of who we let into grad school, who we get to be our keynote speakers at conferences. So for example, I attended the APA convention summer 2020, and a lot of their keynote speakers were people of color, which was great, but they were all talking about diversity issues. There was one panel that was about like cognitive issues, and it was all middle-aged white guys. And so you can't tell me there's not women or people of color or LGBTQ plus individuals who are doing this research, right? So sort of thinking about getting these folks, giving them the opportunity to talk about their actual work and not just what it's like to live in their skin, because they are contributing to the science too. Yeah, I think that's a huge part of it. Yeah, a conference friend of mine, Carolyn Backer, I pull her conference friend because we literally only interact at conferences, but like whenever we see each other, we're like, hey, how you doing? She gave a keynote at my big conference I go to every November a few years ago, and she was just listing all the ways it was like rare. Like she does work on prevention, she's a woman, right? I mean, it was just like a whole bunch of different things where we're missing big swaths of knowledge if we're just checking out and only asking sort of the big names, right? How are these other folks ever going to get to be big names if we're not given those opportunities, right? All right, the last thing I want to do today is again go back to perusal and just look at some of the stuff on the timeline, just because I think that it's interesting historically, and if any of you have taken history and systems with Dr. Jackson, you may have learned some of this before, because he does talk about some of this. So US psychology really started in the late 1800s, and it was kind of starting before that in Europe. It talks about, one of the first people who was recognized as a leader in psychology was Francis Galton. If you don't know who Galton was, he was actually Darwin's cousin. And he's the one who came up with the idea of survival of the fittest. Like Darwin never actually wrote that in those words. And he did a lot comparing the two races and using things like phrenology, which was like, if you touch people's skulls, you can tell things about them. And so he basically said, people who are of different races are inferior. He came up with the idea of eugenics, which if you're not familiar with that concept, it's basically only certain people should be allowed to reproduce. This spawned a bunch of things, including eugenics programs in places like Virginia, where people of color, indigenous people, people who are considered feeble-minded, so often people with psychological disorders or developmental delays, would go in for what they thought were routine procedures and come out unbeknownst to them sterilized. So their tubes would be tied, or they would have a hysterectomy and like never have any idea. So that was based on this. And the other person who based a lot of his ideas on this was Hitler, right? His idea of like a superior race comes from these ideas. So the APA was founded in 1892. So again, we're still a pretty young science, right? There were royal societies for like a lot of the other sciences in the UK way before this. So thinking about, just how things were researched, sort of what are the things going on at this time. They talk about people of other races as primitive and inferior. And, again, this just goes on and on. There was a eugenics record office. Psychologists were involved in eugenics a lot of times. And then we did good things too. So I don't want to say that we were always crappy. And they do as you go on, bring in some of what they talk about. So for example, here are where Black psychologists started doing research, and they found results that contradicted white people. And then some of the most famous African American psychologists, Mamie Phipps Clark and Kenneth Clark, they did the famous doll study where they gave Black children a black doll and a white doll, and they asked them which one do you like better, which one's more intelligent, which one is prettier, and the Black doll answered like the white doll. And they wrote a brief about this, and it was actually used in the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court case to show like discrimination and segregation do influence children. So again, there's some good things in here, but some bad stuff as well. So yeah, I think it's really important as psychologists to recognize our field has not always been happy shiny, right? So and then we've got something in the chat here. So sorry, Emily, that I missed this. So going off on what you just asked, individuals within the psych community must inform people that this issue exists and ask how they can change their ways. The actions speak louder than words really reflects what needs to happen. Yeah, in a sense, the whole inequality exists because there's a lack of opportunity. Need to change that opportunities are accessible to all, not just certain people. Yeah, not just people who have rich parents, right? The amount of times I've seen, I think I've told you all before, I'm part of academic Twitter. And the amount of times I've seen people talking about how their advisor, when they couldn't afford something in grad school, said, well, just ask your parents. Or it's like, if you have blue collar parents, they're not going to be able to just give you $2,000 to do something, right? So I think that's important to know too. All right, so thanks again for coming and participating. Really appreciate it. And I will look forward to seeing y'all next week when we will start talking more about how to lie with statistics. And we talked about some of that bias.